first thing Mark felt when he woke up was an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. The morning light streamed through the half-closed blinds, painting familiar golden slats across the ceiling. The same alarm clock blinked 7:06 a.m. in glaring red numbers. The smell of coffee drifted through the air from the kitchen, though he didn't remember brewing any. He sat up, rubbing his face, an unshakable grogginess weighing on him. Something was off. Mark went through his usual morning routine. Stretch, shower, get dressed. He reached for his phone and noticed the date. March 17th. Again, his stomach tightened. It was an absurd thought, but he knew with chilling certainty that yesterday had also been March 17th. The streets outside were the same. The people moved in identical patterns, and the news anchor on the TV in the diner repeated the same story about a missing hiker in Black Hollow Woods. The waitress, Sarah, spilled coffee on a man's lap, just as she had yesterday. No, the day before. The sense of repetition was suffocating. By noon, the dread clawed deeper into his chest. He tried calling a friend, but the conversation was eerily familiar, as if the same script had been written for him. He went to work, where his boss scolded him for being late, exactly as before. The day dragged on in its monotony, every action feeling like a hollow echo. And then, just before midnight, something changed. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, a sound broke through the silence. A whisper, faint, distant, but it was there. The last thing he heard before sleep took him was the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, approaching. The cycle continued. Mark woke up, suffocated by the weight of routine. The alarm clock blinked 7:06 a.m., casting its eerie red glow across the dimly lit room. The scent of coffee wafted through the apartment, though he hadn't brewed any. The air was thick with something unseen, a silent presence lurking beneath the surface of his existence. At first, he tried to rationalize it. A dream, maybe. A hallucination brought on by stress. But as the days, no, the same day, repeated over and over, the reality of his predicament settled deep into his bones like ice. Every attempt to break the pattern failed. He tried staying awake all night, only to find himself waking up at 7:06 a.m. without recollection of how he had fallen asleep. He left town, drove for hours in a desperate attempt to escape. But no matter how far he went, the world folded back onto itself. By nightfall, he was always back in bed, staring at the ceiling. The whisper creeping closer. The whisper. The first time, it had been barely audible, a distant breath carried on the wind. But as the days stretched on, the sound grew clearer. A voice. It spoke in hushed tones, unintelligible at first, like words wrapped in static. Then came the footsteps, soft, measured, relentless. The first time he truly heard it was on the 12th cycle. He had spent the entire day in the apartment, refusing to engage with the world outside. He didn't go to work. He didn't pick up his phone. He didn't turn on the TV. By nightfall, he sat in bed, heart hammering against his ribs, waiting. The room was silent for what felt like an eternity. Then, step, a single footfall. Not outside, inside. Mark shot up, his breath catching in his throat. The whisper followed. This time, he could almost make out the words. Not long now. His skin crawled. He turned on every light in the apartment, searched every closet, every shadowed corner. But there was nothing. No sign of anyone. And yet, the voice had been inside the room. The next cycle, he tried something new. He set up his phone to record himself while he slept. If he was truly reliving the same day, he needed proof. That night he lay in bed, too afraid to close his eyes. But exhaustion took him anyway. Morning came, 7:06 a.m. With shaking hands, he grabbed his phone and played the recording. The footage showed him sleeping peacefully for hours. Nothing unusual. But then, at 3:12 a.m., the video glitched. For a fraction of a second, the screen went black. Then, something moved. A shadow right beside the bed. Mark's sleeping body remained still, but the shadow leaned in, close enough that it should have been touching him. A shape, indistinct, but unmistakably human. And then the whisper, closer. Mark dropped the phone. His chest tightened as cold sweat drenched his skin. He was being watched. From that moment, the cycles became unbearable. The whisper grew bolder, no longer confined to the dead of night. He heard it in the silence between conversations, in the rustling of leaves, in the static of the TV. The footsteps followed him now, lurking just beyond his vision, always one step behind. Desperation took hold. He tried ending it. He stepped in front of a speeding truck, only to wake up at 7:06 a.m. He swallowed a full bottle of pills, only to wake up at 7:06 a.m. No matter what he did, the day reset, trapping him in its merciless loop. But the voice never reset. It remembered. Each cycle, it came closer. Mark stopped leaving his apartment. He boarded up the windows, blocked the doors, tried to seal himself off from whatever was coming for him. It didn't matter. The whisper was inside the walls now, inside his mind, creeping closer with every passing moment. On the 34th cycle, he saw the shadow again. This time, it wasn't on his phone. It was in the mirror. He stood in the dim glow of the bathroom light, gripping the sink with white-knuckled hands. His reflection looked back at him, but there was something wrong. Behind him, in the doorway, a shape loomed. He spun around. Nothing. But when he looked back at the mirror, the shadow had moved. Closer. His breath hitched. His reflection was no longer just his own. Another presence stood beside it. Tall, dark, featureless. The whisper curled through his ears like smoke. Almost time. Mark slammed his fist into the mirror, shattering it into jagged shards. The voice laughed. Not from the mirror, but from inside his head. He was losing himself. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in bed, clutching a knife, waiting. The voice had stopped whispering. Now, it breathed. Loud, deep, right beside him. At 3:12 a.m., the footsteps began. This time, he saw it. The air in the room rippled like heat distorting the space around him. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping forward with unnatural smoothness. Mark couldn't move. It was him. The figure was Mark, or at least something that wore his form. Its face was a perfect replica, but its eyes were empty, black voids swallowing the light. And then, in his own voice, it spoke. Now it's your turn to watch. The room collapsed into darkness. Mark's world dissolved into blackness. Not the kind of darkness that came when he shut his eyes, nor the type that filled his apartment at night. This was absolute. A void without walls, without ground, without time. And he was sinking. He couldn't tell if he was floating downward or simply falling forever. There was no air, no sound, nothing but the weightless descent into the abyss. His body tingled, his fingers numbed, his limbs felt stretched, as if he was unraveling. Then, a whisper. The same voice. His voice. Now it's your turn to watch. The moment those words slithered through the darkness, something snapped. Mark's body was yanked upward with violent force, like a puppet on unseen strings. The void cracked apart, slivers of distorted light bleeding into the blackness. And suddenly, He woke up. The alarm clock blinked. 7:06 a.m. The smell of coffee filled the air. Mark shot up, lungs heaving, drenched in cold sweat. His apartment was exactly as it had been in every cycle. His phone on the nightstand, the half-drawn blinds casting golden slats across the room. But something was wrong. His breathing slowed. His eyes scanned the room. At first glance, everything seemed normal. But the longer he looked, the more unnatural it became. The shadows stretched at odd angles, as if the light had forgotten how to behave. The ticking of the wall clock was just a fraction too slow, each second lagging behind reality. The air itself felt thicker, as though the walls had moved an inch closer while he wasn't looking. Then he saw the mirror. The cracked remains of his bathroom mirror, the one he had shattered, were gone. In its place, a perfect reflection stared back at him. It was no longer broken. Mark swallowed hard. He needed to test something. He grabbed his phone, hands trembling, and checked the date. March 18th. His breath hitched, his heart pounded. It had changed. He had finally broken the loop, or so he thought. Mark stepped outside for the first time in what felt like forever. The city greeted him with the usual morning bustle, cars honking, pedestrians moving in robotic patterns, the distant hum of life continuing. But something gnawed at him. The air was wrong. The buildings leaned ever so slightly, as if their angles had been bent by unseen hands. People walked too smoothly, their strides eerily identical. Conversations had a faint, mechanical repetition, like a record stuck on the same track. Then, he saw them. They were watching him. Everywhere he turned, he caught glimpses of figures standing motionless, on street corners, behind windows, in parked cars. Their faces were blurred, smeared like wet paint, and every time he blinked, they were closer. Mark's pulse thundered in his ears. He stumbled backward, bumping into a man in a suit. The man turned, his face an exact replica of Mark's. Not just similar, identical. A perfect, hollow-eyed copy. Mark's stomach twisted. He broke into a run, but the city shifted around him. The streets stretched into unfamiliar paths. Buildings melted into indistinct shapes. The sky dimmed, though the sun still hung high. He wasn't in his world anymore. The cycle hadn't ended. It had changed. Mark ran until his legs ached, until his breath came in ragged gasps. He didn't stop until he reached the only place that felt remotely real, his apartment. He slammed the door shut and locked every bolt, heart hammering. He stood in the silence, listening. Then, a creak. The closet door. He turned it slowly. It was open. He hadn't touched it. A void stretched beyond the doorway, swallowing all light. The air hummed, vibrating with unseen energy. And then, something stepped out. Mark's blood ran cold. It was him. The same doppelganger, the same blank stare, the same abyss where its eyes should have been. But this time, there was no whisper. It simply watched. Mark's body froze. His mind screamed for him to move, to run, to do anything. But he was paralyzed. Then the thing smiled. Not a natural smile. A slow, painful stretch of lips that revealed rows of jagged, too sharp teeth. And finally, in Mark's own voice, it spoke again. Now it's your turn to watch. The room twisted. Mark fell, not onto the floor, but into something much deeper. The walls of his apartment peeled away, revealing the same endless void he had awoken in before. He tried to scream, but there was no sound. And then, the loop began again. Mark woke up. 7:06 a.m. The alarm clock blinked. The smell of coffee filled the air. But this time he was not in control. He felt his limbs move, but they weren't his own movements. He watched through his own eyes, trapped within himself, as his body went through the motions. A puppet, a passenger in his own flesh. From the corner of the room, he saw something else rise from the shadows. A new figure, another Mark. It stood beside the bed, watching the body he no longer controlled. Mark understood now. He was no longer the one living the day. He was the observer. The next victim had taken his place, and so the cycle continued, endlessly.